Welcome back to Spectrum Sundays, where we introduce professionals and self-advocates who play an important role in the autism community, as well as in the speech, language, and hearing field.
And this week, we are excited to welcome Susie Smithmyer, who is part of the education realm, and she is an autism support teacher in the Altoona Area School District in Pennsylvania. We're so happy to have you with us today, Susie. Thank you.
Thank you guys for having me. I'm so excited.
So to start off, could you give us a brief resume, including your education and some of your professional experiences?
Of course. So I got my master's degree in 2017 from the University of Pittsburgh, and I'm actually dual certified in social studies education and special education. And I also have a bachelor's degree in history and anthropology, but I kind of took those, went the route of education, and I'm an autism support teacher now. This is my third year, going on my third year. I taught briefly in London, and I am now at the Altoona Area School District, and I love it. I've been in this position for 3 years, and it's been great.
I love that. Well, we can't wait to hear so much more about your experiences, especially in the past 3 years.
Right, and I'm interested because you did say that you have some background in social studies and history. What made you become interested in working with the population of special needs and especially with autism?
So when I was in undergrad, we had to have some volunteer hours to apply for grad school. And I knew that I wanted to be a teacher. I just wasn't really sure which route I wanted to go with. And I love history, I do, but I also always kind of knew that I wanted to be a special educator. So I volunteered at a school in Pittsburgh called the Children's Institute, and it's a private school for kids with disabilities. And I loved it so much. They had such a positive environment, and I worked actually in the exact same position I'm in now, which is quite ironic, but it was so great because the teacher that was there and that I volunteered with, she taught me so much, and some of the students there had problem behaviors, but she was so positive and upbeat, and I always volunteered there on Friday afternoons. And no matter what, she always told me to just go home with a smile on your face. And I loved learning in that environment and how positive it was. And it just made me feel so welcome all the time, even though I was just a volunteer. And I grew to love the students and love that population. And I loved how much fun it was and how much progress I saw in the students. And I knew that that's what I wanted to do.
Well, that's so sweet. Actually, when I first started, I worked at a specialized school for kids with autism, and I started shadowing on Fridays as well. And that was a day of their outing. So, of course, that's like the most fun day. But I think that really also sparked my interest because I got to see them interacting with the community, and that was really special for me.
Mm-hmm.
That's so funny.
Right. And Susie, as you may know, I know you very personally.
Yeah.
So Susie and I go way back, but Francesca and I are both in the speech language pathology field.
Okay.
And when you sent your bio over to us, I saw so much overlap with your field in education and the professionals that you work with as an educator. So as an educator, you also focus on verbal behavior programs and applied behavioral analysis, or more commonly known as ABA. So for anyone that might be unfamiliar, could you explain more about those two practices and then maybe some evidence that supports them?
Definitely. So ABA is evidence-based practices based off of principles of B.F. Skinner. And then the verbal behavior program, which is actually what I learned when I was at the Children's Institute and exactly what we did. It teaches the functions of language and communication and why it's so important. And it's, like I said, it's evidence-based to be proven to work with students with autism, especially those who might be nonverbal or limited verbally. We use operants, they're called operants, and there's all kinds of names for them, but essentially we start with what's called a mand, and if a student wants something, and say they want a cookie, and they don't know how to express that they want a cookie, so they might engage in problem behavior, because they really want this thing, but they don't know how to ask for it. So we as the teachers have to teach them how to ask for what they want. So we might present them with the cookie, and we have to teach them, you know, here's the cookie, and then they'll learn that they have to ask for the cookie, whether it's verbally or on their AAC device or with sign language, and then they receive the cookie if they ask for it appropriately. And I could talk about it for days, but that's kind of the basis of where it starts. But it's using language as the basis of communication and starting there and kind of building up.
Right. And I love how much that integrates within the speech and hearing field, just as that is everything that Fran and I are passionate about. But I also love that you point out that the behaviors that arise from children or adults not knowing how to express themselves, those are often the behaviors that people misinterpret as problem behaviors, or something that's a little bit more scary to the general public. So as you're explaining this, I'm thinking about how you as an educator and us as professionals, we help bridge the gap between what these people are needing and wanting, and then giving them access to the communication modes that they need in order to access those things that they need.
I'm also just curious as to how you schedule your day in the classroom, and what some of the objectives and life skills you include are. What are some of the typical targets that you work with with your students?
So a typical day for my students, you know, they get off the van, they usually eat breakfast. I try to do a morning meeting with them, which is interactive on the smart board. And then we usually have gym class or phys ed, which is inclusion based. So that's with regular ed peers, which I think is fantastic. And then I always like to have them come back and we do like a mindfulness or a meditation just to kind of relax and like reduce stimuli for a bit. And then we get into intensive teaching, which is teaching the operants that I just talked about. And one thing that's so important with my students is providing breaks and reinforcement as necessary. And that's one thing that I always make sure to do. It's 100% necessary, or else they won't progress. And then lunch is also inclusion based. So they eat lunch with regular ed peers. Come back, and we usually do some peer-to-peer stuff, sitting at a table, socialization, we'll do crafts, and we again have to teach the socialization skills, because that is one thing that in students with autism they are lacking, socialization, and they need to learn how to appropriately ask for something from a peer or give something to a peer. And that's things that I have to be able to teach them, because they don't just know how to do it automatically. And then I usually give them a break at the end of the day, and we do some life skills towards the end of the day. We call them ADLs, or activities of daily living. And that might be vacuuming the floor or sweeping stuff off of the desk, wiping the tables down, anything like that, that gives them kind of life skills. And the grade that I teach, which is now has just switched, but it's 6 through 8. So it's middle school. And so they're in that range where they can start to learn the valuable life skills that they'll need to become adults.
That's really great that there's opportunities to be inclusive, such as gym and at lunch. How do some of their peers react, some of their typical peers?
They are usually so fantastic. I know the past 2 phys ed classes have been absolutely amazing with my students, asking them to come join their teams with them. And it, of course, makes me so emotional, and it makes me cry, because that's how it should be all the time. I'm actually also in charge of a club at school called Circle of Friends, and it's an inclusion-based club that meets after school, and it's kind of bridging that gap of regular ed students with my students with disabilities, and having them come together and just having little parties and socialization. And we have a Halloween party and Christmas parties and all of that together, and it's just so great. But I'm trying to get more participation, because the participation on the regular ed side is often low, and I just want, you know, that acceptance and that awareness to be a bit higher, so that we can have more participation and more students to join.
Right. And Susie and I are both graduates of the Altoona Area School District. So I remember hearing a lot about the Circle of Friends when I was in high school, but I was not involved. Were you a participant?
I did participate, and I didn't know at all that it existed at the
Mm-hmm.
junior high level, unfortunately. And then at high school, I believe I did it so briefly, and it's something that I regret looking back on, because now the fields that we're in and how passionate about everything we are now, but I'm trying to make a difference and build it up into a big program now. So
Exactly. I just remember hearing bits and pieces of it, and it sounded something that was interesting, but you and I were involved in majorettes, so that kind of kept us really busy. So I'm so
yeah.
glad to hear that that's still up and running, and that there's someone there to advocate at a different level to make sure that there's more involvement as the years go on. And the more I talk with you, it's clearly evident how passionate you are about working with this population. And something that really helps build a positive learning environment is building trust with your students. So I wanted to ask what ways you do this, or how you accomplish this in your own classroom. Do you have any fun activities that you do with your class to build that trust?
I love doing Fun Food Fridays. That's my thing. It got a little bit messy once COVID started, but it was something that I'm a bit passionate about, and I think that it's really cool because it incorporates life skills, and again, the peer-to-peer socialization. They have to pass each other different food products and go find the knife. Can you get me the spoon? What is this? And they have to identify different things. So it incorporates all of the different operants that I had talked about, and also making it fun. And they can, if they can eat the products that they made, but also just building rapport and finding out what is reinforcing to each individual student. You might have a student who loves food, might like Skittles or M&Ms, and another student might like trains or airplanes, and you have to find what works best for each individual student and use that as the reinforcement for them.
I'm really glad that you brought that up, because especially with working with children who have autism, you have to be aware of how individualized that their support needs to be. So what are some ways that you ensure that you're providing an education that is individualized and accessible for each of your students? I know earlier you mentioned AAC, which is a really great form of social communication, but also you mentioned sign language. So how do you incorporate those things?
Honestly, I just kind of look at each student's IEP. I adjust it as necessary, or I don't know. It's kind of one of those things that I have to learn as I go along with it too, because I didn't know any sign language when I got a student who used sign language. So I had to look up videos, and I was constantly on my iPad, like I would look up the simple sign language of it, nothing too complex, but just to make sure that I knew what I was doing so that I could teach it appropriately. And then same with the AAC devices, like each one is kind of a little bit different, like, and there's all different apps. So just making sure that I knew what I was doing and individualizing it for each student, because each one does have something so different. I had some students who were fully verbal, some who used devices, some who used sign language, and I had to cater to each individual one and what is on their IEP and their specially designed instruction. So
I love hearing the references for AAC and sign language. And you mentioned this privately to us, that you do collaborate with your SLP in the schools. But as Francesca and I are learning through our education, a lot of the discussions my classmates have had, they've had concerns about what that collaboration looks like in schools, because the teachers have so much on their plate. And then it's kind of like the SLP is in her own room, and he or she exists like in this vacuum where the kids just go see her separately. So I'm so interested to see and hear more about how that looks like for you in your classroom. But I'm going to put you in the hot seat a little bit. I want to know what qualities that you think make an exceptional teacher for those with special needs. And I'm sure you possess all of them, but for our viewers especially, I want them to hear what you think is it that makes an exceptional teacher.
I think you have to be compassionate. You have to be passionate too about what you're doing. Patience is absolutely key in this field, and being empathetic, and also I think being a little bit realistic, because you have to have a touch of reality when working with these students. But also I am a firm believer in having like an upbeat personality, and being able to build that rapport with students is so important, and just loving what you do. Because I know that even on my toughest days, like some days that really beat me down and I just go home so exhausted, like I still am excited to go back to work the next day. And I love it so much. So
following up with that, what are some ways that the general public can adopt those qualities so that if they do interact with someone with special needs, they can practice acceptance in their daily life?
I think that to start, it kind of has to start at a younger age. Like I think that elementary schools really need to jump on board with inclusion right from the get-go. You know, kindergarten, like these are your students who have disabilities, we're playing with them, and incorporate it right off the bat. But in cases where that isn't happening or it can't happen, I think showing the wide spectrum of what autism looks like, and that not every person with autism necessarily looks like they might have autism. I think that's a huge misconception too, is that, you know, you can see sometimes when somebody is walking down the street or the hallway in school, like, oh, okay, I know that person has autism. And I hate using like autistic, because it should be person first language always, which I'm sure you guys have learned in school. So yeah, just seeing and like observing the different behaviors and how it looks throughout, because I work with some very difficult students who have very difficult problem behaviors. And I don't think some people are used to seeing that or know what that looks like.
Right. I love the point that you made about starting as early as possible. So whenever that representation is ingrained in these students' brains, by the time that they start school, you know, abnormal becomes normal, or there is no such thing as normal. So it's a lot easier to tolerate and accept each other for their differences, and then even going a step further to appreciate those differences, because it makes, you know, it makes life fun, it makes life interesting to have different experiences to share with one another.
I saw a great infographic one time, and I wish that I had it up, but it was essentially what inclusion looks like. And it was, you know, inclusion looks like the student in a wheelchair, or the student who is blind and has a cane to walk with, but it's also the student who has EBD, which is emotional disturbances, and might lash out, or the student who has autism that you might not know has autism, or has Tourette's, and etc. You know, it's the whole range of any disability possible. So it's accepting literally everybody.
Exactly.
And if I could highlight something you mentioned really briefly, but it's an important concept, because I was actually just thinking about it earlier today, is you have to be realistic, but also remain optimistic and hopeful. It's a balance between those two different qualities and mindsets, but it's so important to create success for your individuals that you're teaching and working with. Understanding where their limitations are, but also where their skills and talents are, so you can build upon those.
Yes.
And that's something that I'm currently learning as a speech language pathology student, and so is Megan. So we're curious as to how your interprofessional life is in the school system. What types of staff are you working with usually? I know you mentioned speech language pathologist earlier, but are there others as well?
Yes, so I'm so lucky. I have a great group of aides in my classroom who are so helpful. They help me facilitate education, learning, any activities I might have. They also help monitor for problem behaviors. And I also work with consultants through Patent, which is the state training. And they come in and they're BCBAs, which are board certified behavioral analysts. They come in about once a month and they consult with me. And since they're higher, they help me with problem behaviors and as well as the curriculum that I'm working with. And then the SLPs, depending on the student's IEP and the student's needs, will come in as necessary. And like I said, I'm just really lucky because I have a great group of people who I work with, and it makes it super easy. And I get to collaborate so easily with kind of all of them. So I have it very lucky, but it's great when you have a good group to work with. It makes it so much easier.
I have a few follow-up questions with that. We wanted to talk to you a little bit about what COVID-19 has done for your daily school schedule. And first, I wanted to ask you about how you've adapted to serve your students during these crazy times. But I also want to know what this collaboration in the classroom looks like if you have been doing it online over Zoom, if you still have those professionals within the classroom. What does your team look like now whenever things have become more virtual?
It was definitely more choppy, but it still happened. So we would do kind of bigger group consultations than the individualized ones that I was used to in the classroom. But one thing that was nice is over Zoom, you can have multiple windows open. So I would have my SLP come on with my one student, and we would do what she needed to do for her sessions. And then I would stay on, take my data, she would take her data, and we kind of collaborated that way. And then we would always communicate with each other afterwards. And it was difficult. We worked through it. We're still going to be working through it a little bit here in the upcoming months. But we would have shorter sessions over Zoom and kind of modified lessons. But we still pretty much got through all of the goals and objectives that were on the student's IEP and made sure that they were still getting all of the accommodations and modifications that were necessary in their education.
That's amazing. And as I was listening to you speak, I was kind of thinking about what you mentioned earlier about the different life skills activities that you give your students to do throughout the day. And I'm someone that always looks for the silver lining in things. So I'm just sitting here thinking with COVID-19, they have plenty of things to wipe down and clean and sanitize whenever you get back into your classroom.
Yes, they definitely do. And that will be their chores at the end of the day. For ADLs, wiping down the tables.
Perfect. Silver lining.
Yes.
And let me just say how much your role as a teacher, especially being a special ed teacher, we appreciate what you do and all the hard work that you're putting in behind the scenes as well. It's beyond words. Thank you so much for what you do.
Thank you. I love it.
So we often mention on our series, Spectrum Sundays, that we learn more from the individuals that we teach, much more than what we teach them usually. So what are some valuable life lessons or experiences that you've learned from the individuals you worked with and some of the students you've worked with?
I think one of the most important things is that progress is progress, no matter how slow it might be. And the other is to not take life too seriously. I just look at my students and there's so much joy and happiness in certain things that they do and certain things that they interact with. And it makes me realize that sometimes things that I see as problems aren't really problems at all. And how much I take for granted that I can do such simple things. But I honestly learn different things from them every day. And again, it's something I could talk about for days on end, but progress is progress. And I think that's that's so important, and that, you know, to not take life too seriously, to just live it up and enjoy the simple things.
Absolutely. And, you know, that's something that's so rewarding about the profession that we're in, is that it's a constant learning experience. And what we know today is going to only twofold. And in 10 years down the road, who even knows what kind of educators and professionals that we will be because of the experiences that we will gain. So I love to hear you have that personal sentiment about how much you learn each and every day. You know, it's not like at the end of the year you reflect and you all of a sudden think, oh, well, this happened, this happened. It's at the end of the day, you're thinking, I learned this, and this from these students, and that's how I'll do things better the next day and going forward. So I wanted to touch a little bit upon something that you mentioned earlier, and that's the misconceptions and negative stereotypes that are often associated with autism. So these ideas that people hold are sometimes due to the behavioral differences in people with autism, but they can also be really harmful sometimes. So I wanted to ask, what are some things that you would like others to understand better about the students that you teach?
I wish that people would just see that they have such big hearts, and that each one is so different, and that there are certain skills that they lack that they don't lack on purpose. I think that's really important to realize, that the socialization sometimes just isn't there, and the communication is lacking because it simply isn't taught and it isn't there yet. It's not because they're doing it on purpose. And I just wish that more people would understand that aspect of it all. And again, just that different things might trigger different behaviors, especially out in public, and things that might be so minor to us, or we might not even think about, will be completely triggering for a student or a person with autism, such as a noise or a sound, or a ticking that we might not even hear, but that they can hear because of sensory processing disorder. Or, you know, some students don't like the feeling of jeans, and if they're out in jeans for a day, it's so little, it's little things like that that we don't think about, that, you know, we have to take into account about other people, and especially those with autism and those around us.
Exactly. And if I could even add something a little bit to that, is that the general public doesn't always understand that those negative behaviors, or problem behaviors, as you called them, are often means of communication. There's some type of need that is not being met, and that's why there is sometimes a meltdown, that we would call it, or problem behaviors that arise from it. So if someone is watching, they experience that, or if they're in a grocery store and they're noticing children acting a certain way with their parents, instead of passing a judgment in that circumstance, maybe take a step back and evaluate the situation and consider that it could be just a means of communication for that individual.
That's actually a fantastic way to put it.
Thank you.
So on the topic of diversity within communication and needs, Megan and I really try to advocate for more neurodiversity in our community and more acceptance, and what inclusion looks like. And you talked about that a little bit earlier. So for our viewers who are watching, what are some tips and advice that you could give on acceptance and inclusion, and what would that look like?
Again, I think that if you don't have a club at school, such as Circle of Friends or something, to see if a special ed teacher would be willing to sponsor something like that, get involved, talk to the students in your classes that have disabilities, you know, talk to the students who has an aide, or we call them SEAs, or paraprofessionals that are walking around with them that you might not usually talk to. I think that's so important, is to just show that you're a friendly face. And yeah, just start communication, start talking, include people whenever you can, at lunch, in any situation. and just do it from like, not just from the kindness of your heart, but also because you're helping. Like, honestly, you're helping them become fully functional. And when they graduate school, and I'm just talking from my experience because I am an educator, you know, that they'll be able to go to the food court at the mall and interact with peers on an appropriate level. And that's what we want, you know, ultimately. So I think having that same peer-to-peer interaction and inclusion is ultimately what we want. And if people could start it where there might not be any of it, would be a great way to go.
Exactly. So you mentioned Circle of Friends, and another organization that popped up in my mind was Best Buddies.
Okay.
So anyone that's watching, if that isn't something that is organized within your school or in your community, that's you can look into reaching out to Best Buddies as opening up a chapter in that area.
That would be fantastic. Yes.
So Fran and I are actively involved in the autism community. So we're kind of on the outskirt end of the education realm. So we focus a lot more on the community, the general community, and how we can get them involved and invested in helping the autism community. So what is one message that you want our viewers to take away from our conversation today if they're kind of in that general public?
Again, I would just like to get across how important it is to see autism as a spectrum and how different it is for each individual. And that, again, like, you might not see it on an individual and on a person, but just because you can't see it doesn't mean that a disability isn't there. And that's one takeaway that I hold so dear to my heart, especially seeing some of the students that I have and that are in the schools just around me, that you might not be able to see their disability, but you know that it's there. And I think what's so hard for me in those situations is that other students don't know. And that's where the inclusion and understanding and acceptance and kind of everything we had already talked about comes into play, because you might see a behavior or a student talking a different way or talking about stuff that might not be age appropriate, but you have to be accepting and understanding of where that person is coming from, because they're on a different level, and just acceptance.
Exactly. So, you know, as I'm listening to you speak about that and share that kind of advice, I'm thinking how, even if you don't see a disability, regardless if it's apparent that there's a disability, approaching every person with kindness and compassion is such a great way to live your life. It helps you find value in yourself, and you can walk away from the day knowing that at least I shared one smile with someone. Maybe that helped brighten their day, and maybe by chance they had autism and that's the first social interaction that they've had with someone all day long. So approaching every situation as if you don't know their circumstance, but it doesn't matter because you're still sharing that kindness and compassion.
Yeah. There's really no harm in being kind, so you might as well just be kind.
Exactly.
I love the quote that's like, in a world where you can be anything, be kind. So that's my favorite.
I love that.
Oh, that's so lovely. Thank you so much for all of your wisdom and experiences that you've shared today. As we're wrapping up, do you have any final thoughts or pieces of encouragement that you'd like to share with our viewers, either about autism or maybe in the upcoming school year?
I don't think so. I know I've talked so much about acceptance and just understanding, and that's kind of my biggest takeaway. And if anybody is watching who has students or children who are in school, just to make sure that you're also educating them on how to treat others with kindness, you know, and it goes around the whole way, just with everyone, like we talked about. So you never know what somebody is dealing with. So
Exactly.
it's a good philosophy to have.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all of your experience and your sentiments and encouragement with us today, Susie. We have so much enjoyed this conversation.
Thanks.
And we're very We're very much looking forward to bringing back Susie in just a few more weeks. So please stay tuned. If you enjoyed her interview today, we will be looping her in for some more fun questions to get to know her personality a little bit more. Thank you everyone for watching today, and we will see you next week on Spectrum Sundays.